Hello everybody, welcome to tonight's reading stream. I was actually going to have a better background and some fireplace or rain sounds, but then I thought I'm too fucking lazy. So I'm gonna reuse this background, and today we're gonna be reading a psychology book by Carl Jung. One second. Just closing the door. And I have the book in my hands right now. I've read half of it, but I'm happy to reread it with you guys. One of the books that really inspired me to keep my own dream journal. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Please do tell me if the audio is off or you can't hear me or something like that. はい、始めましょう。The importance of dreams. Man uses the spoken or written word to express the meaning of what he wants to convey. His language is full of symbols, but he also often employs signs or images that are not strictly descriptive. Some are mere abbreviations or strings of initials, such as UN, UNICEF, or UNESCO. Others are familiar trademarks, the names of patent medicines, badges, or insignia. Although these are meaningless in themselves, they have acquired a recognizable meaning through common usage or deliberate intent. Such things are not symbols. They are signs, and they do no more than denote the objects to which they are attached. What we call a symbol is a term, a name, or even a picture that may be familiar in daily life, yet that possesses specific connotations in addition to its conventional and obvious meaning. It implies something vague, unknown, or hidden from us. Many Cretan monuments, for instance, are marked with the design of the double adze. This is an object that we all know, but we do not know its symbolic implications. For another example, take the case of the Indian who, after a visit to England, told his friends at home that the English worship animals because he had found eagles, lions, and oxen in old churches. He was not aware, nor are many Christians, that these animals are symbols of the evangelists and are derived from the vision of Ezekiel, and that this, in turn, has an analogy to the Egyptian sun god Horus and his 4 sons. There are, moreover, such objects as the wheel and the cross that are known all over the world, yet have a symbolic significance under certain conditions. Precisely what they symbolize is still a matter for controversial speculation. Thus, a word or an image is symbolic when it implies something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. It has a wider, unconscious aspect that is never precisely defined or fully explained, nor can one hope to define or explain it. As the mind explores the symbol, it is led to the ideas that lie beyond the grasp of reason. The wheel may lead our thoughts towards the concept of a divine sun, but at this point, reason must admit its incompetence. Man is unable to define a divine being. When, with all our intellectual limitations, we call something divine, we have merely given it a name, which may be based on a creed, but never on factual evidence. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic terms to represent concepts that we cannot define or fully comprehend. This is one reason why all religions employ symbolic language or images. But this conscious use of symbol is only one aspect of a psychological fact of great importance. Man also produces symbol unconsciously and spontaneously in the form of dreams. It is not easy to grasp at this point, but the point must be grasped if we are to know more about the ways in which the human mind works. Man, as we realize, if we reflect for a moment, never perceives anything fully or comprehends anything completely. He can see, hear, touch, and taste, but how far he sees, how well he hears, what his touch tells him, and what he tastes depend upon the number and quality of his senses. These limit his perception of the world around him. By using scientific instruments, he can partly compensate for the deficiencies of his senses. For example, he can extend the range of his vision by binoculars, or of his hearing by electrical amplification. But the most elaborate apparatus cannot do more than bring distant or small objects within the range of his eyes, or make faint sounds more audible. No matter what instrument he uses, at some point he reaches the edge of certainty beyond which conscious knowledge cannot pass. There are, moreover, unconscious aspects of our perception of reality. The first is the fact that even when your senses react to real phenomena, sights and sounds, they are somehow translated from the realm of reality into that of the mind. Within the mind, they become psychic events, whose ultimate nature is unknowable, for the psyche cannot know its own physical substance. Thus, every experience contains an indefinite number of unknown factors, not to speak of the fact that every concrete object is always unknown in certain respects, because we cannot know the ultimate nature of matter itself. Then, there are certain events of which we have not consciously taken note. They have remained, so to speak, below the threshold of consciousness. They have happened, but they have been absorbed subliminally, without our conscious knowledge. We can become aware of such happenings only in a moment of intuition, or by a process of profound thought that leads to a later realization that they must have happened. And though we may have originally ignored their emotional and vital importance, it later wells up from the unconscious as a sort of afterthought. It may appear, for instance, in the form of a dream. As a general rule, the unconscious aspect of any event is revealed to us in dreams, where it appears not as rational thought, but as symbolic image. As a matter of history, it was the study of dreams that first enabled psychologists to investigate the unconscious aspect of conscious psychic events. It is on such evidence that psychologists assume the existence of an unconscious psyche, though many scientists and philosophers deny its existence. They argue, naively, that such an assumption implies the existence of two subjects, or, to put it in a common phrase, two personalities within the same individuals. But this is exactly what it does imply, quite correctly. And it is one of the curses of modern man that many people suffer from. This divided personality. It is by no means a pathological symptom. It is a normal fact that can be observed at any time and everywhere. It is not merely the neurotic whose right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. This predicament is a symptom of a general unconsciousness that is the undeniable common inheritance of all mankind. Man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously, in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state, which is arbitrarily dated from the invention of script in about 4000 BC. And this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. What we call the psyche is by no means identical with our consciousness and its contents. Whoever denies the existence of the unconscious is, in fact, assuming that our present knowledge of the psyche is total. And this belief is clearly just as false as the assumption that we know all there is to be known about the natural universe. Our psyche is part of nature, and its enigma is as limitless. Thus, we cannot define either the psyche or nature. We can merely state what we believe them to be and describe, as best we can, how they function. Quite apart, therefore, from the evidence that medical research has accumulated, there are strong grounds of logic for rejecting statements like, "There is no unconscious." Those who say such things merely express an age-old misoneism. これちょっと読めないですけど A fear of the new and the unknown. If you suddenly hear me pause, it's because I was coughing and muting my mic. There are historical reasons for this resistance to the idea of an unknown part of the human psyche. Consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature, and it is still an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul, which means, as the name indicates, a noticeable disruption, or, more technically, a dissociation I'm failing, of consciousness. Among such people, whose consciousness is at a different level of development from ours, the soul, or psyche, is not felt to be a unit. Many primitives assume that a man has a bush soul, as well as his own, and that this bush soul is incarnate in a wild animal or a tree with which the human individual has some kind of psychic identity. This is what the distinguished French ethnologist Lucien Lévy-Bourg called a mystical participation. He later retracted this term under pressure of adverse criticism, but I believe that his critics were wrong. It is a well-known psychological fact that an individual may have such an unconscious identity with some other person or object. This identity takes a variety of forms among primitives. If the bush soul is that of an animal, the animal itself is considered to be some sort of brother to the man. A man whose brother is a crocodile, for instance, is supposed to be safe when swimming a crocodile-infested river. If the bush soul is a tree, the tree is presumed to have something like parental authority over the individual concerned. Oh my god. Wait, what? Was that Andrew? Thank you so much, Andrew. Did it show up? What? I have no idea why, but the alert box is not showing. That's weird. I did receive it though. Thank you so much, Andrew. He said, "Here to buy a candy for your neck." ありがとうございます。In both cases, an injury to the bush soul is interpreted as an injury to the man. In some tribes, it is assumed that a man has a number of souls. This belief expresses the feeling of some primitive individuals that they each consist of several linked but distinct units. This means that the individual psyche is far from being safely synthesized. On the contrary, it threatens to fragment only too easily under the onslaught of unchecked emotions. While this situation is familiar to us from the studies of anthropologists, it is not so irrelevant to our own advanced civilization as it might seem. We too can become dissociated and lose our identity. We can be possessed and altered by moods, or become unreasonable and unable to recall important facts about ourselves or others, so that people ask, "What the devil has gotten into you?" We talk about being able to control ourselves, but self-control is rare and remarkable virtue. We may think we have ourselves under control, yet a friend can easily tell us things about ourselves of which we have no knowledge. Beyond doubt, even in what we call a high level of civilization, human consciousness has not yet achieved a reasonable degree of continuity. It is still vulnerable and liable to fragmentation. This capacity to isolate parts of one's mind, indeed, is a valuable characteristic. À, ありがとうございます. Bên chị thành phát xã của em bữa giờ vẫn quên xem cả. Cảm ơn bạn Nguyễn Trường Tín. Thank you so much. It enables us to concentrate upon one thing at a time, excluding everything else that may claim our attention. But there is a world of difference between a conscious decision to split off and temporarily suppress part of one's psyche, and a condition in which this happens spontaneously without one's knowledge or consent and even against one's intention. The former is a civilized achievement, the latter a primitive loss of a soul, or even the pathological cause of a neurosis. Thus, even in our day, the unity of consciousness is still a doubtful affair. It can too easily be disrupted. An ability to control one's emotion that may be very desirable from one point of view would be a questionable accomplishment from another, for it would deprive social intercourse of variety, color, and warmth. It is against this background that we must review the importance of dreams, those flimsy, evasive, unreliable, vague, and uncertain fantasies. To explain my point of view, I would like to describe how it developed over a period of years and how I was led to conclude that dreams are the most frequent and universally accessible source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty. Sigmund Freud was the pioneer who tried to explore empirically the unconscious background of consciousness. He worked on the general assumption that dreams are not a matter of chance, but are associated with conscious thoughts and problems. This assumption was not in the least arbitrary. It was based upon the conclusion of eminent neurologists, for example, Pierre Janet, that neurotic symptoms are related to some conscious experience. They even appear to be split-off areas of the conscious mind, which, at other time and under different conditions, can be conscious. Before the beginning of this century, Freud and Joseph Breuer, I cannot say his name, Breuer, had recognized that neurotic symptoms, hysteria, certain types of pain, and abnormal behavior are in fact symbolically meaningful. They are one way in which the unconscious mind expresses itself, just as it may in dreams, and they are equally symbolic. A patient, for instance, who is confronted with an intolerable situation may develop a spasm whenever he tries to swallow. He cannot swallow it. Under similar conditions of the psychological stress, another patient has an attack of asthma. He can't breathe the atmosphere at home. A third suffers from a peculiar paralysis of the legs. He can't walk, i.e., he can't go on anymore. A fourth, who vomits when he eat, cannot digest some unpleasant fact. I could cite many examples of this kind, but such physical reactions are only one form in which the problems that trouble us unconsciously may express themselves. They more often find expression in our dreams. Any psychologist who has listened to numbers of people describing their dreams know that dream symbols have much greater variety than the physical symptoms of neurosis. They often consist of elaborate and picturesque fantasies, But if the analyst who is confronted by this dream material uses Freud's original technique of free association, he finds that dreams can eventually be reduced to certain basic patterns. This technique played an important part in the development of psychoanalysis, for it enabled Freud to use dreams as the starting point from which the unconscious problems of the patient might be explored. Freud made the simple but penetrating observation that if a dreamer is encouraged to go on talking about his dream images and the thought that these prompts in his mind, he will give himself away and reveal the unconscious background of his ailments, in both what he says and what he deliberately omits saying. His ideas may seem irrational and irrelevant, but after a time it becomes relatively easy to see what it is that he is trying to avoid, what unpleasant thought or experience he is suppressing. No matter how he tries to camouflage it, everything he says points to the core of his predicament. A doctor sees so many things from the seamy side of life that he is seldom far from the truth when he interprets the hints that his patient produces as signs of an uneasy conscience. What he eventually discovers, unfortunately, confirms his expectations. Thus far, nobody can say anything against Freud's theory of repression and wish fulfillment as apparent causes of dream symbolism. Freud attaches particular importance to dreams as the point of departure for a process of free association. But after a time, I began to feel like this was misleading and inadequate use of the rich fantasies the unconscious produces in sleep. My doubts really began when a colleague told me of an experience he had during the course of a long train journey in Russia. Though he did not know the language and could not even decipher, Cyrillic script, he found himself musing over the strange letters in which the railway notices were written, and he fell into a reverie in which he imagined all sorts of meanings for them. One idea led to another, and in his relaxed mood, he found that this free association has stirred up many old memories. Among them, he was annoyed to find some long-buried disagreeable topics, things he wished to have forgotten and had forgotten consciously. He had, in fact, arrived at what psychologists would call his complexes, that is, repressed emotional themes that can cause constant psychological disturbances, or even, in many cases, the symptoms of a neurosis. This episode opened my eyes to the fact that it was not necessary to use a dream as a point of departure for the process of free association, if one wished to discover the complexes of a patient. It showed me that one can reach the center directly from any point of the compass. One could begin from Cyrillic letters, from meditations upon a crystal ball, from prayer wheels, or a modern painting, or even from casual conversation about some trivial event. The dream was no more and no less useful in this respect than any other possible starting point. Nevertheless, dreams have a particular significance, even though they often arise from an emotional upset in which the habitual complexes are also involved. The habitual complexes are the tender spots of the psyche, which react most quickly to an external stimulus or disturbance. That is why free association can lead one from any dream to the critical, secret thoughts. I forgot to get my water. 1 second. At this point, however, It occurred to me that, if I was right so far, it might reasonably follow that dreams have some special and more significant function of their own. Very often, dreams have a definite, evidently purposeful structure, indicating an underlying idea or intention. Though, as a rule, the latter is not immediately comprehensible. I therefore began to consider whether one should pay more attention to the actual form and content of a dream, rather than allowing free association to lead one off through a train of ideas to complexes that could as easily be reached by other means. This new thought was a turning point in the development of my psychology. It meant that I gradually gave up following associations that led far away from the text of a dream. I chose to concentrate rather on the associations to the dream itself, believing that the latter expressed something specific that the unconscious was trying to say. The change in my attitude towards dreams involved a change of method, the new technique that one could take account of all the various wider aspects of a dream. A story told by the unconscious mind has a beginning, a development, and an end, but the same is not true of a dream. Its dimensions in time and space are quite different. To understand it, you must first examine it from every aspect, just as you may take an unknown object in your hands and turn it over and over until you're familiar with every detail of its shape. Perhaps I have now said enough to show how I came increasingly to disagree with the free association as Freud first employed it. I wanted to keep as close as possible to the dream itself, and to exclude all the irrelevant ideas and associations that it might evoke. True, these could lead one towards the complexes of a patient, but I had a more far-reaching purpose in mind than the discovery of complexes that cause neurotic disturbances. There are many other means by which these can be identified. The psychologist, for instance, can get all the hints he needs by using word association tests, by asking the patient what he associates to a given set of words, and by studying his responses. But to know and understand the psychic life process of an individual's whole personality, it is important to realize that his dreams and their symbolic images have a much more important role to play. Almost everyone knows, for example, that there is an enormous variety of images by which the sexual act can be symbolized, or, one might say, represented in the form of an allegory. Each of these images can lead, by a process of association, to the idea of sexual intercourse, and to specific complexes that any individual may have about his own sexual attitudes. But one could just as well unearth such complexes by daydreaming on a set of indecipherable Russian letters. I was thus led to the assumption that a dream can contain some message other than the sexual allegory, and that it does so for definite reasons. To illustrate this point, a man may have a dream of inserting a key in a lock, of wielding a heavy stick, or of breaking down a door with a battering ram. Each of these can be regarded as a sexual allegory, but the fact that his unconscious, for its own purposes, has chosen one of these specific images, it may be the key, the stick, or the battering ram, is also of major significance. The real task is to understand why the key has been preferred to the stick, or the stick to the ram, and sometimes this might even lead one to consider that it is not the sexual act at all that is being represented, but some quite different psychological point. From this line of reasoning, I concluded that only the material that is clearly and visibly part of a dream should be used in interpreting it. The dream has its own limitation. Its specific form itself tells us what belongs to it and what leads away from it, while free association lures one away from from that material in a kind of zigzag line. 1 second. I'm smelling my guinea pig's poop and I'm about to die. 1 second. Okay. From this line of reasoning, I concluded that only the material that is clearly and visibly part of a dream should be used in interpreting it. The dream has its own limitation. Its specific form itself tells us what belongs to it and what leads away from it. While free association lures one away from that material in a kind of zigzag line, the method I evolved is more like an circumambulation, whose center is the dream picture. I work all around the dream picture and disregard every attempt that the dreamer makes to break away from it. Time and time again, in my professional work, I have had to repeat the words, "Let's get back to your dreams. What does the dream say?" For instance, a patient of mine dreamed of a drunken and disheveled vulgar woman. In the dream, it seemed that this woman was his wife, though in real life, his wife was totally different. On the surface, therefore, the dream was shockingly untrue, and the patient immediately rejected it as dream nonsense. If I, as a doctor, had let him start a process of association, he would inevitably have tried to get as far as possible from the unpleasant suggestion of his dream. In that case, he would have ended with one of his staple complexes, a complex, possibly, that had nothing to do with his wife, and we should have learned nothing about the special meaning of this particular dream. What then was his unconscious trying to convey by such an obviously untrue statement? Clearly, it somehow expressed the idea of a degenerate female who was closely connected with the dreamer's life. But since the projection of this image onto his wife was unjustified and factually untrue, I had to look elsewhere before I found out what this repulsive image represented. In the Middle Ages, long before the physiologists demonstrated that by reason of our glandular structure, there are both female and male elements in all of us, it was said that every man carries a woman within himself. It is this female element in every male that I have called the anima. This feminine aspect is essentially a certain inferior kind of relatedness to the surroundings, and particularly to women, which is kept carefully concealed from others, as well as from oneself. In other words, though an individual's visible personality may seem quite normal, he may well be concealing from others, or even from himself, the deplorable condition of the woman within. That was the case with this particular patient. His female side was not nice. His dream was actually saying to him, "You are in some respects behaving like a degenerate female," and thus gave him an appropriate shock. An example of this kind, of course, must not be taken as evidence that the unconscious is concerned with moral injunctions. The dream was not telling the patient to behave better, but was simply trying to balance the lopsided nature of his unconscious mind, which was maintaining the fiction that he was a perfect gentleman throughout. It is easy to understand why dreamers tend to ignore and even deny the message of their dreams. Consciousness naturally resists anything unconscious and unknown. I have already pointed out the existence among primitive people of what anthropologists called mycenium, a deep and superstitious fear of novelty. The primitives manifest all the reactions of a wild animal against untoward events. But civilized men react to new ideas in much the same way, erecting psychological barriers to protect themselves from the shock of facing something new. This can easily be observed in any individual's reaction to his own dreams when obliged to admit a surprising thought. Did I say thought? Yes, thought. Many pioneers in philosophy, science, and even literature have been victims of the innate conservatism of their contemporaries. Psychology is one of the youngest of the sciences because it attempts to deal with the working of the unconscious. It has inevitably encountered misonesium in an extreme form. Past and future in the unconscious. So far, I have been sketching some of the principles on which I approach the problems of dreams. For even when we want to investigate man's faculty to produce symbols, dreams prove to be the most basic and accessible material for this purpose. The two fundamental points in dealing with dreams are these. First, the dream should be treated as a fact, about which one must make no previous assumption except that it somehow makes sense. And the second, the dream is a specific expression of the unconscious. One could scarcely put these principles more modestly. No matter how low anyone's opinion of the unconscious may be, he must concede that it is worth investigating. The unconscious is, at least on a level with the loose, which, after all, enjoys the honest interest of entomologists. If somebody with little experience and knowledge of dreams thinks that dreams are just chaotic occurrences without meaning, he is at liberty to do so. But if one assumes that they are normal events, which, as a matter of fact, they are, one is bound to consider that they are either causal, i.e., that there is a rational cause for their existence, or, in a certain way, purposive, or both. Let us now look a little more closely at the ways in which the conscious and unconscious contents of the mind are linked together. Take an example with which everyone is familiar. Suddenly, you can't remember what you were going to say next, though a moment ago, the thought was perfectly clear. Or perhaps you were about to introduce a friend, and his name escapes you as you were about to utter it. You say you can't remember. In fact, though the thought has become unconscious, or at least momentarily separated from consciousness. We find the same phenomenon with our senses. If we listen to a continuous note on the fringe of audibility, the sound seems to stop at regular intervals and then start again. Such oscillations are due to a periodic decrease and increase in one's attention, not to any change in the note. But when something slips out of our consciousness, it does not cease to exist, any more than a car that has disappeared round a corner has vanished into thin air. It is simply out of sight. Just as we may later see the car again, so we come across thoughts that were temporarily lost to us. Thus, part of the unconscious consists of a multitude of temporarily obscured thoughts, impressions, and images that, in spite of being lost, continue to influence our conscious minds. A man who is distracted or absent-minded will walk across the room to fetch something. He stops, seemingly perplexed. He has forgotten what he was after. His hands grope about among the objects on the table as if he was sleepwalking. He is oblivious of his original purpose, yet he is unconsciously guided by it. Then he realizes what it is that he wants. His unconscious has prompted him. If you observe the behavior of a neurotic person, you can see him doing many things that he appears to be doing consciously and purposefully. Yet, if you ask him about them, you will discover that he is either unconscious of them or has something quite different in mind. He hears and does not hear. He sees, yet is blind. He knows and is ignorant. Such examples are so common that the specialists soon realize that unconscious contents of the mind behave as if they were conscious, and that you can never be sure, in such cases, whether thought, speech, or action is conscious or not. It is this kind of behavior that makes so many physicians dismiss statements by hysterical patients as utter lies. Such persons certainly produce more untruths than most of us, but lie is scarcely the right words to use. In fact, their mental state causes an uncertainty of behavior because their unconsciousness is liable to unpredictable eclipse by an interference from the unconscious. Even their skin sensations may reveal similar fluctuations of awareness. At one moment, the hysterical person may feel a needle prick in the arm. At the next, it may pass unnoticed. If his attention can be focused on a certain point, the whole of his body can be completely anesthetized, so hard, until the tension that has caused this blackout of the senses has been relaxed. Sense perception is then immediately restored. All the time, however, he has been unconsciously aware of what was happening. The physician can see this process quite clearly when he hypnotizes such a patient. It is easy to demonstrate that the patient has been aware of every detail. The prick in the arm or the remark made during an eclipse of a consciousness can be recalled as accurately as if there has been no anesthesia or forgetfulness. I recall a woman who was once admitted to the clinic in a state of complete stupor. Not stupor. Thank you so much, Joe, for the cough syrup that you may need tomorrow. Thank you so much. I did not see that. That was 10 minutes ago. The alert box is having some issues. Thank you. When she recovered consciousness the next day, she knew who she was, but did not know where she was, how or why she had come there, or even the date. Yet, after I had hypnotized her, she told me why she had fallen ill, how she had gotten to the clinic, and who had admitted her. All these details could be verified. She was even able to tell the time at which she had been admitted, because she had seen a clock in the entrance hall. Under hypnosis, her memory was as clear as if she had been completely conscious the entire time. When we discuss such matters, we usually have to draw on evidence supplied by clinical observation. For this reason, many critics assume that the unconscious, and all its subtle manifestations, belong solely to the sphere of psychopathology. They consider any expression of the unconscious as something neurotic or psychotic, which has nothing to do with a normal mental state. But neurotic phenomena are by no means the products exclusively of disease. They are, in fact, no more than pathological exaggerations of normal occurrences. It is only because they are exaggerations that they are more obvious than their normal counterparts. Hysterical symptoms can be observed in all normal persons, but they are so light that they usually pass unnoticed. Forgetting, for instance, is a normal process in which certain conscious ideas lose their specific energy because one's attention has been deflected. When interest turns elsewhere, it leaves in shadow the things with which one was previously concerned, just as a searchlight lights upon a new area by leaving another in darkness. This is unavoidable, for consciousness can keep only a few images in full clarity at one time, and even this clarity fluctuates. But the forgotten ideas have not ceased to exist. Although they cannot be reproduced at will, they are present in a subliminal state, just beyond the threshold of recall, from which they can rise again spontaneously at any time, often after many years of apparently total oblivion. I'm speaking here of things we have consciously seen or heard and subsequently forgotten. But we all hear, see, smell, and taste many things without noticing them at the time, either because our attention is deflected or because the stimulus to our senses is too slight to leave a conscious impression. The unconscious, however, has taken note of them, and such subliminal sense perceptions play a significant part in our everyday lives. Without our realizing it, they influence the way in which we react to both events and people. An example of this that I found particularly revealing was provided by a professor who had been walking in the country with one of his pupils, absorbed in serious conversation. Suddenly, he noticed that his thoughts were being interrupted by an unexpected flow of memories from his early childhood. He He could not account for this distraction. Nothing in what he had said seemed to have any connection with these memories. On looking back, he saw that he had been walking past a farm when the first of these childhood recollections had surged in his mind. He suggested to his people that they should walk back to the point where their fantasies had begun. Once there, he noticed the smell of geese and instantly realized that this smell had touched off the flow of memories. In his youth, he has lived on a farm where geese were kept, and their characteristic smell had left a lasting, though forgotten, impression. As he passed the farm on his walk, he had noticed the smell subliminally, and this unconscious perception had called back long-forgotten experiences of his childhood. The perception was subliminal because the attention was engaged elsewhere, and the stimulus was not strong enough to deflect it and to reach consciousness directly. Yet it had brought up the forgotten memories. Such a cue or trigger effect can explain the onset of neurotic symptoms, as well as more benign memories when a sight, smell, or sound recalls a circumstance in the past. A girl, for instance, may be busy in her office, apparently in good health and spirit. A moment after, she develops a blinding headache and shows other signs of distress. Without consciously noticing it, she had heard the foghorn of a distant ship, and this has unconsciously reminded her of an unhappy parting with a lover whom she had been doing her best to forget. Aside from normal forgetting, Freud has described several cases that involve the forgetting of disagreeable memories, memories that one is only too ready to lose. As Nietzsche remarked, where pride is insistent enough, memory prefers to give way. Thus, among the lost memories, we encounter not a few that owe their subliminal state and their incapacity to be voluntarily reproduced to their disagreeable and incompatible nature. The psychologists call these repressed contents. A case in point might be that of a secretary who is jealous of one of her employer's associates. She habitually forgets to invite this person to meetings, though the name is clearly marked on the list she is using. But if challenged on the point, she simply says she forgot or was interrupted. She never admits, not even to herself, the real reason for her omission. Many people mistakenly overestimate the role of willpower and think that nothing can happen to their minds that they do not decide and intend. But one must learn to discriminate carefully between intentional and unintentional contents of the mind. The former are derived from the ego personality. The latter, however, arrives from a source that is not identical with the ego, but is its other side. It is this other side that would have made the secretary forget the invitations. There are many reasons why we forget things that we have noticed or experienced, and there are just as many ways in which they may be recalled to mind. An interesting example is that of cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia, or concealed recollection. An author may be writing steadily to a preconceived plan, working out an argument, or developing the line of a story, when he suddenly runs off at a tangent. Perhaps a fresh idea has occurred to him, or a different image, or a whole new subplot. If you ask him what prompted the digression, he will not be able to tell you. He may not have even noticed the change, though he has now produced material that is entirely fresh and apparently unknown to him before. Yet it can sometimes be known convincingly that what he had written bears a striking similarity to the work of another author, a work that he believes he has never seen. I myself found a fascinating example of this in Nietzsche's book Thus Spake Zarathustra, where the author reproduces almost word for word an incident reported in a ship's log for the year 1686. By sheer chance, I had read the seaman's immature yarn in a book published about 1835, half a century before Nietzsche wrote. And when I found the similar passage in Thus Spake Zarathustra, I was struck by its particular... Funny chat. Its peculiar style, which was different from Nietzsche's usual language. I was convinced that Nietzsche must also have seen the old book, though he made no reference to it. I wrote to his sister, who was still alive, and she confirmed that she and her brother had in fact read the book together when he was 11 years old. I think, from the context, it is inconceivable that Nietzsche had any idea he was plagiarizing the story. I believe that 50 years later, it had unexpectedly slipped into focus in his conscious mind. In this type of case, there is genuine, if unrealized, recollection. Much the same sort of thing may happen to a musician who has heard a peasant tune or popular song in childhood and finds it cropping up as a theme of symphonic movement that he is composing in adult life. An idea or an image has moved back from the unconscious into the conscious mind. What I have so far said about the unconscious is no more than a cursory sketch of the nature and functioning of this complex part of the human psyche. But it should have indicated the kind of subliminal material from which the symbols of our dreams may be spontaneously produced. This subliminal material can consist of all urges, impulses, and intentions, all perceptions and intuitions, all rational or irrational thoughts, conclusions, inductions, deductions, and premises, and all varieties of feeling. Any or all of these can take the form of partial, temporary, or constant unconsciousness. Such material has mostly become unconscious because, in a manner of speaking, there is no room for it in the conscious mind. Some of one's thought lose their emotional energy and become subliminal. That is to say, they no longer receive so much of our conscious attention, because they have come to seem uninteresting or irrelevant, or because there is some reason why we wish to push them out of sight. It is, in fact, normal and necessary for us to forget in this fashion, in order to make room for our unconscious mind for new impressions and ideas. If this did not happen, everything we experienced would remain above threshold of consciousness and our minds would become impossibly cluttered. This phenomenon is so widely recognized today that most people who know anything about psychology take it for granted. But just as conscious contents can vanish into the unconscious, new contents, which have never yet been conscious, can arise from it. One may have an inkling, for instance, that something is on the point of breaking into consciousness, that something is in the air, or that one smells a rat. The discovery that the unconscious is no mere depository of the past, but is also full of germs of future psychic situations and ideas, led me to my own new approach to psychology. A great deal of controversial discussion has arisen from this point, but it is a fact that, in addition to memories from a long-distance conscious past, completely new thoughts and creative ideas can also present themselves from the unconscious. Thoughts and ideas that had never been conscious before. They grow up from the dark depths of a mind like a lotus and form the most important part of the subliminal psyche. We find this in everyday life, where dilemmas are sometimes solved by the most surprising new propositions. Many artists, philosophers, and even scientists owe some of their best ideas to inspiration that appears suddenly from the unconscious. The ability to reach a rich vein of such material and to translate it effectively into philosophy, literature, music, or scientific discovery is one of the hallmarks of what is commonly called genius. we can find clear proof of this fact in the history of science itself. For example, the French mathematician Poincaré, no idea how to say that, and the chemist I cannot read words, owed important scientific discoveries, as they themselves admit, to sudden pictorial revelations from the unconscious. The so-called mystical experience of the French philosopher Descartes involved a similar sudden revelation in which he saw in flash the order of all sciences. The British author Robert Louis Stevenson had spent years looking for a story that would fit his strong sense of man's double being, when the plot of Dr. Jekyll, I suck at reading, and Mr. Hyde was suddenly revealed to him in a dream. Later, I shall describe in more detail how such material arises from the unconscious, and I shall examine the form in which it is expressed. At the moment, I simply want to point out that the capacity of the human psyche to produce such new material is particularly significant when one is dealing with dream symbolism, for I have found again and again in my professional work that the images and ideas that dreams contain cannot possibly be explained solely in terms of memory. They express new thoughts that have never yet reached the threshold of consciousness. I have gone into some detail about the origins of our dream life, because it is the soil from which most symbols originally grow. Unfortunately, dreams are difficult to understand. As I have already pointed out, a dream is quite unlike a story told by the conscious mind. In everyday life, one thinks out what one wants to say, selects the most telling way of saying it, and tries to make one's remarks logically coherent. For instance, an educated person will seek to avoid a mixed metaphor because it may give a muddled impression of his point. But dreams have a different texture. Images that seem contradictory and ridiculous crowd in on the dreamer. The normal sense of time is lost, and the commonplace things can assume a fascinating or threatening aspect. It may seem strange that the unconscious mind should order its material so differently from the seemingly disciplined pattern that we can impose on our thoughts in walking life. Yet anyone who stops for a moment to recall a dream will be aware of this contrast, which is in fact one of the main reasons why the ordinary person finds dreams so hard to understand. They do not make sense in terms of his normal waking experience, and he therefore is inclined to either disregard them or to confess that they baffle them. Perhaps it may be easier to understand this point if we first realize the fact that the ideas with which we deal in our apparently disciplined walking life are by no means as precise as we like to believe. On the contrary, their meaning and their emotional significance for us becomes more imprecise the more closely we examine them. The reason for this is that anything we have heard or experienced can become subliminal, that is to say, can pass into the unconscious. And even what we retain in our conscious mind can reproduce at will has acquired an unconscious undertone that will color the idea each time it is recalled. Our conscious impressions, in fact, quickly assume an element of unconscious meaning that is physically significant for us, though we are not consciously aware of the existence of the subliminal meaning or of the way in which it both extends and confuses the conventional meaning. Of course, such psychic undertones differ from one person to another. Each of us receives any abstract or general notion in the context of the individual mind, and we, therefore, understand and apply it in our individual ways. When, in conversation, I use any such terms as state, money, health, or society, I assume that my listeners understand more or less the same thing I do. But the phrase more or less makes my point. Each word means something slightly different to each person, even among those who share the same cultural background. The reason for this variation is that a general notion is received into an individual context and is therefore understood and applied in slightly individual ways. And the difference of meaning is naturally greatest when people have widely different social, political, religious, or psychological experiences. As long as concepts are identical with mere words, the variation is almost imperceptible and plays no practical role. But when an exact definition or a careful explanation is needed, one can occasionally discover the most amazing variations, not only in the purely intellectual understanding of the term, but particularly in its emotional tone and its application. As a rule, these variations are subliminal and therefore never realized. One may tend to dismiss such differences as redundant or expendable nuances of meanings that have little relevance. That's funny. Relevance to everyday needs. But the fact that they exist shows that even the most matter-of-fact contents of consciousness have a... I've never seen this word before. Penumbra? Penis rumba. What? Of uncertainty around them. Even the most carefully defined philosophical or mathematical concept, which we are sure does not contain more than we have put into it, is nevertheless more than we assume. Oh my god, thank you so much, Inanna. Thank you so much. Wait, are you also a VTuber? Dude, you're a union as well? I'm happy. PP numbness. Okay. It is a psychic event, and as such, partly unknowable. The very numbers you use in counting are more than you take them to be. They are at the same time mythological elements. For the Pythagoreans, they were even divine. Pythagoreans. I suck at names. But you are certainly unaware of this when you use numbers for a practical purpose. Every concept in our conscious mind, in short, has its own psychic association. While such associations may vary in intensity, according to the relative importance of the concept to our whole personality, or according to other ideas and even complexes to which it is associated in our unconscious, they are capable of changing the normal character of that concept. It may even become something quite different as it drifts below the level of consciousness. These subliminal aspects of everything that happens to us may seem to play very little part in our daily lives, but in dream analysis, where the psychologist is dealing with the expression of the unconscious, they are very relevant, for they are almost invisible roots of our conscious thoughts. That is why commonplace objects or ideas can assume such powerful psychic significance in a dream that we may awake seriously disturbed, in spite of having dreamed of nothing worse than a locked room or a missed train. The images produced in dreams are much more picturesque and vivid than the concepts and experiences that are their waking counterparts. One of the reasons for this is that in a dream, such concepts can express their unconscious meaning. In our conscious thoughts, we restrain ourselves within the limits of rational statements that are much less colorful because we have stripped them of most of their psychic association. Purple streaming place. The Purple Streaming Place. Is that a name of a organization? That's super cool. Happy to be here. Thank you so much. Happy to have you. Oh, it's Twitch. Oh. Shit. Fuck. I sound like... What is it called? A boomer. ごめん。はい。戻りましょう。I recall one dream of my own that I found difficult to interpret. In this dream, a certain man was trying to get behind me and jump on my back. I knew nothing of this man, except that I was aware that he had somehow picked up a remark I had made and twisted it into a grotesque travesty of my meanings. But I could not see the connection between this fact and his attempts in the dream to jump on me. In my professional life, however, it has often happened that someone has misinterpreted what I have said, so often that I have scarcely bothered to wonder whether this kind of misrepresentation makes me angry. Now, there is a certain value in keeping a conscious control over one's emotional reactions, and this, I soon realized, was the point the dream had made. It had taken an Austrian colloquialism and translated it into a pictorial image. This phrase, common enough in ordinary speech, I'm not gonna speak it. It's Austrian, I don't know how to say it. You can climb on my back, which means I don't care what you say about me. An American equivalent, which could easily appear in a similar dream, would be, go jump in the lake. One could say that this dream picture was symbolic, for it did not state the situation directly, but it expressed the point indirectly by means of a metaphor that I could not at first understand. When this happens, as it so often does, it is not deliberate disguise by a dream. It simply reflects the deficiencies in our understanding of emotionally charged pictorial language. For in our daily experiences, we need to state things as accurately as possible, and we have learned to discard the trimmings of fantasy, both in our language and in our thoughts. I can't speak now, what the fuck? Thus losing... I can't speak now, what the fuck? I keep looking at the chat, I'm sorry. Okay. Gotta ignore chat for a second. Most of us have consigned to the unconscious all the fantasy psychic associations that every object or idea possesses. The primitive, on the other hand, is still aware of these psychic properties. He endows animals, plants, or stones with powers that we find strange and unacceptable. An African jungle dweller, for instance, sees a nocturnal creature by daylight and knows it to be a medicine man who has temporarily taken its shape. Or he may regard it as the bush soul or the ancestral spirit of one of his tribes. A tree may play a vital part in the life of a primitive, apparently possessing for him its own soul and voice, and the man concerned will feel that he shares its fate. There are some Indians in South America who will assure you that they are red arara parrots, though they are well aware that they lack feathers, wings, and beaks. Just like I'm a crow, without any of the crow things. For in the primitive world of things do not have the same sharp boundaries they do in our rational societies. What psychologists call psychic identity, or mystical participation, has been stripped off our worlds of things. But it is exactly this halo of unconscious association that gives a colorful and fantastic aspect to the primitive world. We have lost it to such a degree that we do not recognize it when we meet it again. With us, such things are kept below the threshold. When they occasionally reappear, we even insist that something is wrong. I have more than once been consulted by well-educated and intelligent people who have had peculiar dreams, fantasies, or even visions, which have shocked them deeply. They have assumed that no one who is in a sound state of mind could suffer from such things, and that anyone who actually sees a vision must be pathologically disturbed. A theologian, how the fuck do I say this? Theologian, fuck, English is hard, once told me that Ezekiel's vision were nothing more than a morbid symptom, and that when Moses and other prophets hear voices speaking to them, they were suffering from hallucinations. You can imagine the panic he felt when something of this kind of spontaneous happened to him. We are so accustomed to the apparently rational nature of our world that we can scarcely imagine anything happening that cannot be explained by common sense. The primitive man, confronted by a shock of this kind, would not doubt his sanity. He would think of fetishes, spirits, or gods. Yet the emotions that affect us are just the same. In fact, the terrors that stem from our elaborate civilization may be far more threatening than those that primitive people attribute to demons. The attitude of modern civilized man sometimes remind me of a psychotic patient in my clinic who was himself a doctor. One morning, I asked him how he was. He replied that he had had a wonderful night disinfecting the whole of heaven with the mercuric chloride, but that in the course of his thoroughgoing sanitary process, he had found no trace of God. Here we see a neurosis, or something worse. Instead of God, or the fear of God, there is an anxiety neurosis, or some kind of phobia. The emotion has remained the same, but its object has changed both its name and nature for the worse. I recall a professor of philosophy who once consulted me about his cancer phobia. He suffered from a compulsive conviction that he had a malignant tumor, although nothing of the kind was ever found in dozens of X-ray pictures. "Oh, I know there's nothing," he would say, "but there might be something." What was it that produced this idea? It obviously came from a fear that was not instilled by conscious deliberation. The morbid thought suddenly overcame him, and it had a power of its own that he could not control. It was far more difficult for this educated man to make an admission of this kind than it would have been for a primitive to have said that he was plagued by a Guys, I think it's been too long and I can't read anymore. It was going so smoothly in the beginning, and now I'm just stumbling. See? I can't even say stumbling. Been reading for 1 hour. Maybe it's COVID? Dude, get well soon. I think I'm gonna... Okay, let's see. Oh my god, okay. The chapter's almost over. I'll try my best to finish it. And then we'll end stream, okay? Okay. What the fuck? The malign influence of evil spirits is at least an admissible hypothesis in a primitive culture, but it is a shattering experience for a civilized person to admit that his troubles are nothing more than a foolish prank of the imagination. The primitive phenomenon of obsession has not vanished. It is the same as ever. It is only interpreted in a different and more obnoxious way. I have made several comparisons of this kind between modern and primitive man. Such comparisons, as I shall show later, are essential to an understanding of the symbol-making propensities of man, and of the part that dreams play in expressing them. For one finds that many dreams present images and associations that are analogous to primitive ideas, myths. Great, guys, I'm fucking dead. I hope you rewatch the stream from the beginning and see how proud I was of being so smooth speaking, and now I'm just fucking illiterate. Okay. Myths and rites. These dreams images were called archaic remnants by Freud. The phrase suggests that they are psychic elements surviving in the human mind from ages ago. This point of view is characteristic of those who regard the unconscious as a mere appendix of consciousness, or more picturesquely, a trash that can collect all the refuses of the conscious mind. A trash can. I missed can. Jesus Christ. Further investigation suggested to me that this attitude is untenable and should be discarded. I found that associations and images of this kind are an integral part of the unconscious and can be observed everywhere, whether the dreamer is educated or illiterate, intelligent or stupid. They are not, in any sense, lifeless or meaningless remnants. They still function, and they are especially valuable, just because of their historical nature. They form a bridge between ways in which we consciously express our thoughts and a more primitive, more colorful, and pictorial form of expression. It is this form, as well, that appeals directly to feeling and emotion. These historical associations are the link between rational world of consciousness and the world of instinct. I have already discussed the interesting contrast between the controlled thoughts we have in our waking life and the wealth of imagery produced in dreams. Now you can see another reason for this difference. Because in our civilized life, we have stripped so many ideas of their emotional energy, we do not really respond to them anymore. We use such ideas in our speech, and we show a conventional reaction when others use them, but they do not make a very deep impression on us. Something more is needed to bring certain things home to us effectively enough to make us change our attitude and our behavior. That is what dream language does. Its symbolism has so much psychic energy that we are forced to pay attention to it. There was, for instance, a lady who was well known for her stupid prejudices and her stubborn resistance to reasoned argument. One could have argued with her all night to no effect. She would have taken not the slightest notice. Her dreams, however, took a different line of approach. One night, she dreamed she was attending an important social occasion. She was greeted by the hostess with the words, "How nice that you would come. All your friends are here, and they are waiting for you." The hostess then led her to the door and opened it, and the dreamer stepped through into a cowshed. Get roasted. This dream language was simple enough to be understood even by a blockhead. The woman would not at first admit the point of the dream that struck so directly at her self-importance, but its message nevertheless went home. And after a time, she had to accept it because she could not help seeing the self-inflicted joke. Such messages from the unconscious are of greater importance than most people realize. In our conscious life, we are exposed to all kinds of influences. Other people stimulate or depress us. Events at the office or in our social life distract us. Such things seduce us into following ways that are unsuitable to our individuality. Whether or not we are aware of the effect they have on our consciousness, it is disturbed by and exposed to them almost without defense. This is especially the case with a person whose extroverted attitude of the mind lays all the emphasis upon external objects, or who harbors feelings of inferiority and doubt concerning his own innermost personality. The more that consciousness is influenced by prejudices, errors, fantasies, and infantile wishes, the more the already existing gap will widen into a neurotic dissociation and lead to a more or less artificial life far removed from healthy instincts, nature, and truth. The general function of dreams is to try and restore our psychological balance by producing dream material that reestablishes, in a subtle way, the total psychic equilibrium. This is what I call the complementary or compensatory role of dreams in our psychic makeup. It explains why people who have unrealistic ideas or too high an opinion of themselves, who make grandiose plans out of proportion to their real capacities, have dreams of flying or falling. The dream compensates for the deficiencies of their personalities, and at the same time, it warns them of the dangers in their present course. If the warnings of the dreams are disregarded, real accidents may take their place. The victim may fall downstairs or may have a motor accident. I remember the case of a man who was inextricably involved in a number of shady affairs. He developed an almost morbid passion for dangerous mountain climbing as a sort of compensation. He was seeking to get above himself. In a dream one night, he saw himself stepping off a summit of a high mountain into empty space. When he told me his dream, I instantly saw his danger and tried to emphasize the warning and persuade him to restrain himself. I even told him that the dream foreshadowed his death in a mountain accident. It was in vain. 6 months later, he stepped off into space. A mountain guide watched him, and a friend letting themselves down on a rope in a difficult place. The friend had found a temporary foothold on a ledge, and the dreamer was following him down. Suddenly, he let go of the rope. According to the guide, it was as if he was jumping down into the air. He fell upon his friend, and both went down and were killed. Another typical case was that of a lady who was living above herself. She was high and mighty in her daily life, but she had shocking dreams, reminding her of all sorts of unsavory things. When I uncovered them, she indignantly refused to acknowledge them. The dreams then became menacing and full of references to the walks she has used to take by herself in the woods, where she indulged in soulful fantasies. I saw her danger, but she would not listen to my many warnings. Soon afterwards, she was savagely attacked in the woods by a sexual pervert, but for the intervention of some people who had heard her screams, she would have been killed. There was no magic in this. What her dreams had told me was that this woman had a secret longing for such an adventure, such as the mountain climber unconsciously sought the satisfaction of finding a definite way out of his difficulties. Obviously, neither of them expected the stiff price involved. She had broken several bones, and he had paid with his life. Thus, dreams may sometimes announce certain situations long before they actually happen. This is not necessarily a miracle or a form of precognition. Many crises in our lives have a long unconscious history. We move towards them step by step, unaware of the dangers that are accumulating. But what we consciously fail to see is frequently perceived by our unconscious, which can pass the information through dreams. Dreams may often warn us in this way, but just as often, it seems, they do not. Therefore, an assumption of the benevolent hand restraining us in time is dubious. Or, to state it more positively, it seems that a benevolent agency is sometimes at work and sometimes not. The mysterious hand may even point the way to perdition. Dreams sometimes prove to be traps, or appear to be so. They sometimes behave like the Delphic oracle that told King Croesus that if he crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a large kingdom. It was only after he had been completely defeated in battle, after crossing that, he discovers the kingdom meant by the oracle was his own. One cannot afford to be naive in dealing with dreams. They originate in a spirit that is not quite human, but is rather a breath of nature, a spirit of the beautiful and generous, as well as the cruel goddess. If we want to characterize the spirit, we shall certainly get closer to it in the sphere of ancient mythologies, or of the fables in, what is this word? Primeval? ちょっとわかんない。どこかな? Oh yeah, forest. Why do I keep mixing it up? Consciousness of modern man. I am not denying that the great gains have resulted from evolution of civilized societies. But these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. Part of the purpose of my comparisons between primitive and civilized states of man has been to show the balance of these losses and gains. Primitive man was much more governed by his instincts than are his rational modern descendants. I cannot read, help. Descendants, who have learned to, quote-unquote, control themselves. In this civilizing process, we have increasingly divided our consciousness from the deeper instinctive strata of the human psyche, and even ultimately from the somatic basis of the psychic phenomenon. Fortunately, we have not lost these basic instinctive strata. They remain part of I read the chat. Part of the unconscious, even though they may express themselves only in the form of dream images. These instinctive phenomena, one may not, incidentally, always recognize them for what they are, for their character is symbolic, play a vital part in what I have called the compensating function of dreams. For the sake of mental stability and even physiological health, the unconscious and the conscious must be integrally connected and thus move on parallel lines. If they are split apart or dissociated, psychological disturbances follows. In this respect, dream symbols are the essential message carriers from the instinctive to the rational parts of the human mind, and their interpretation enriches the poverty of consciousness so that it learns to understand again the forgotten language of the instincts. Of course, people are bound to query this function, since its symbol so often pass unnoticed or uncomprehended. In normal life, the understanding of dreams is often considered superfluous. I can illustrate this by my experience with a primitive tribe in East Africa. To my amazement, these tribesmen deny that they had any dreams. But through patient, indirect talk with them, I can't read. I soon found out that they had dreams just like everyone else, but that they were convinced their dreams had no meaning. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they told me. They thought that the only dreams that mattered were those of chiefs and medicine men. These, which concerned the welfare of the tribe, were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief and medicine men both claimed that they had ceased having meaningful dreams. They dated this change from the time the British came to their country. The district commissioner, the British official in charge of them, had taken over the function of the great dreams that had, hitherto, guided the tribe's behavior. When these tribesmen conceded that they did have dreams, but thought them meaningless, they were like the modern men who think that a dream had no significance, simply because he does not understand it. But even a civilized man can sometimes observe that a dream, which he may not even remember, can alter his mood, for better or for worse. The dream has been comprehended, but only in a subliminal way. And that is what usually happens. It is only on the rare occasions that, when a dream is particularly impressive or repeats itself at regular intervals, that most people consider an interpretation desirable. Here, I ought to add a word of warning against unintelligent or incompetent dream analysis. There are some people whose mental condition is so unbalanced that the interpretation of their dreams can be extremely risky. In such a case, a very one-sided consciousness is cut off from a correspondingly irrational or crazy unconscious, and the two should not be brought together without taking special precautions. And, speaking more generally, it is plain foolishness to believe in ready-made systematic guides to dream interpretation, as if one could simply buy a reference book and look up a particular symbol. No dream symbol can be separated from the individual who dreams it, and there is no definite or straightforward interpretation of any dream. Each individual varies so much in the way that his unconscious complements or compensates his conscious mind that it is impossible to be sure how far dreams and their symbols can be classified at all. It is true that there are dreams and single symbols, I should prefer to call them motives, I guess, that are typical and often occur. Among such motifs are falling, flying, being persecuted by dangerous animals or hostile men, being insufficiently or absurdly clothed in public spaces, being in a hurry or lost in a miling crowd, fighting with useless weapons or being wholly defenseless, running hard yet getting nowhere. A typical infantile motif is the dream of growing infinitely small or infinitely big, or being transformed from one to the other, as you find it, for instance, in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. But I must stress again that these are motifs that must be considered in the context of the dream itself, not as self-explanatory ciphers. The recurring dream is a noteworthy phenomenon. There are cases in which people have dreamt the same dream from childhood into the later years of adult life. A dream of this kind is usually an attempt to compensate for a particular defect in the dreamer's attitude to life, or it may date from a traumatic moment that has left behind some specific prejudice. It may also sometimes anticipate a future event of importance. I myself dreamed of a motif over several years, in which I would discover a part of my house that I did not know existed. Sometimes it was the quarters where my long-dead parents lived, in which my father, to my surprise, had a laboratory where he studied the comparative anatomy of fish, and my mother ran a hotel for ghostly visitors. Usually, this unfamiliar guest wing was an ancient historical building, long forgotten, yet my inherited property. It contained interesting antique furniture, and toward the end of this series of dreams, I discovered an old library whose books were unknown to me. Finally, in the last dream, I opened one of the books and found in it a profusion of the most marvelous symbolic pictures. When I awoke, my heart was palpitating with excitement. Sometime before I had had this particular last dream of the series, I had placed an order with an antiquarian bookseller for one of the classic compilations of medieval alchemists. I had found a quotation in literature that I thought might have some connection with early Byzantine alchemy, and I wished to check it. Several weeks after I had had the dream of the unknown book, the parcel arrived from the bookseller. Inside was a parchment volume dating from the 16th century. It was illustrated by fascinating symbolic pictures that instantly reminded me of those I had seen in my dream. As the rediscovery of the principles of alchemy came to be an important part of my work as a pioneer of psychology, the motif of my recurring dreams can be easily understood. The house, of course, was a symbol of my personality and its conscious field of interest, and the unknown annex represented the anticipation of a new field of interest and research of which my conscious mind was at that time unaware. From that moment, 30 years ago, I never had the dream again. Okay, and that was that. Wait, no. Fuck me. There's still 3 more pages. You know what? I'll try. I misread. There's still 3 more pages. I began this essay by noting the difference between a sign and a symbol. The sign is always less than the concept it represents, while a symbol always stands for something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. Symbols, moreover, are natural and spontaneous products. No genius ever sat down with a pen or a brush in his hand and said, "Now I'm going to invent a symbol." No one can take a more or less rational thought, reached as a logical conclusion or by deliberate intent, and then give it a symbolic form. No matter what fantastic trappings one may put upon an idea of this kind, it will still remain a sign, linked to the conscious thought behind it, not a symbol that hints at something not yet known. In dreams, symbols occur spontaneously, for dreams happen and are not invented. They are, therefore, the main source of all our knowledge about symbolism. But symbols, I must point out, do not occur solely in dreams. They appear in all kinds of psychic manifestations. There are symbolic thoughts and feelings, symbolic acts and situations. It often seems that even inanimate objects cooperate with the unconscious in the arrangement of symbolic patterns. There are numerous, well-authenticated stories of clocks stopping at the moment of their owner's death. One was the pendulum clock in the palace of Frederick the Great at Sanssouci, which stopped when the emperor died. Other common examples are those of a mirror that breaks, or a picture that falls when a death occurs, or minor but unexplained breakages in a house when someone is passing through an emotional crisis. Even if skeptics refuse to credit such reports, stories of this kind are always cropping up, and this alone should serve as the ample proof of their psychological importance. There are many symbols, however, among them the most important, that are not individual but collective in their nature and origin. These are chiefly religious images. The believer assumes that they are of divine origin, that they have been revealed to man. The skeptic says, flatly, that they had been invented. Both are wrong. It is true, as the skeptic notes, that the religious symbols and concepts have for centuries been the object of careful and quiet, conscious elaboration. It is equally true, as the believer implies, that their origin is so far buried in the mystery of the past that they seem to have no human source. But they are in fact collective representations, emanating from primeval dreams and creative fantasies. As such, these images are involuntary, spontaneous manifestations and by no means intentional inventions. This fact, as I shall later explain, has a direct and important bearing upon the interpretation of dreams. It is obvious that if you assume the dream to be symbolic, you will interpret it differently from a person who believes that the essential, energizing thought or emotion is known already and is merely disguised by the dream. In the latter, dream interpretation makes little sense, for you find only what you already know. It is for this reason that I have always said to my pupils, learn as much as you can about symbolism, then forget it all when you're analyzing a dream. This advice is of such practical importance that I have made it a rule to remind myself that I could never understand somebody's dream well enough to interpret it correctly. I have done this in order to check the flow of my own associations and reactions, which might otherwise prevail over my patient's uncertainties and hesitations. As it is of the greatest therapeutic importance for the analyst to get the particular message from a dream, that is, the contribution that the unconscious is making to the conscious mind, as accurately as possible. It is essential for him to explore the content of a dream with the utmost thoroughness. I had a dream when I was working with Freud that illustrates this point. I dreamed that I was in my home, apparently on the first floor, in a cozy, pleasant sitting room furnished in the manner of the 18th century. I was astonished that I had never seen this room before and began to wonder what the ground floor was like. I went downstairs and found the place was rather dark, with paneled walls and heavy furniture dating from the 16th century or even earlier. My surprise and curiosity increased. I wanted to see more of the whole structure of this house. So I went down to the cellar where I found a door opening to a flight of stone steps that led to a large vaulted room. The floor consisted of large slabs of stone, and the walls seemed very ancient. I examined the mortar and found it was mixed with splinters of brick. Obviously, the walls were of Roman origin. I became increasingly excited. In one corner, I saw an iron ring in a stone slab. I pulled up the slab and saw yet another narrow flight of steps leading to a kind of cave, which seemed to be a prehistoric tomb containing 2 skulls, some bones, and broken shards of pottery. Then I woke up. If Freud, when he analyzed this dream, had followed my method of exploring its specific associations and context, he would have heard a far-reaching story. But I am afraid he would have dismissed it as a mere effort to escape from a problem that was really his own. The dream is in fact a short summary of my life, more specifically of the development of my mind. I grew up in a house 200 years old. Our furniture consists mostly pieces about 300 years old, and mentally, my hitherto greatest spiritual adventure had been to study the philosophies of Kant and Schopenhauer. The great news of the days was the work with Charles Darwin. Shortly before this, I'd been living with the still medieval concepts of my parents, for whom the world and men were still presided over by the divine omnipotence and providence. This world had become antiquated and obsolete. My Christian faith has become relative through its encounter with Eastern religions, and Greek philosophy. It is for this reason that the ground floor was so still, dark, and obviously uninhabited. My then historical interest had developed from an original preoccupation with comparative anatomy and paleontology? How do I say that? While I was working as an assistant in the Anatomical Institute, I was fascinated by the bones of fossil men, particularly by the much discussed Neanderthalensis, wow, great, and the still more controversial skull of Dubois' Pithecanthropus. Never mind. Pithecanthropus. Okay. As a matter of fact, these were my real associations to the dreams, but I did not dare to mention the subject of skulls, skeletons, or corpses to Freud, because I had learned that this theme was not popular with him. He cherished the peculiar idea that I anticipated his early death, and he drew this conclusion from the fact that I had shown much interest in the mummified corpses in the so-called Blake Keller in Bremen, which we visited together in 1909 on our way to take the boat to America. Thus, I felt reluctant to come out with my own thoughts. Since the recent experience, I was deeply impressed by the most unbridgeable gap between Freud's mental outlook and background and my own. I was afraid of losing his friendship if I opened up to him about my own inner world, which, I surmised, would look very queer to him. Feeling quite uncertain about my psychology, I almost automatically told him a lie about my free association in order to escape the impossible task of enlightening him about my very own personal and utterly different constitution. I must apologize for this rather lengthy narration of the jam I gotten into telling Freud about my dream. But it is a good example of the difficulties in which one gets involved in the course of a real dream analysis. So much depends on the personal differences between the analyst and the analyzed. I soon realized that Freud was looking for some incompatible wish of mine, and I suggested tentatively that the skulls I had dreamt of might refer to some certain members of my family whose death, for some reason, I might desire. This proposal met with his approval, but I was not satisfied with such a phony solution. While I was trying to find a suitable answer to Freud's question, I was suddenly confused by an intuition about the role that the subjective factor plays in psychological understanding. My intuition was so overwhelming that I thought only of how to get out of this impossible snarl, and I took the easy way out by a lie. This was neither elegant nor morally defensible, but otherwise I would have risked a fatal row with Freud. I can't even say Freud anymore, fuck. And I did not feel up to that for many reasons. My intuition consisted of the sudden and most unexpected insight into the fact that my dream meant myself, my life, and my world, my whole reality against a theoretical structure erected by another strange mind for reasons and purposes of its own. It was not Freud's dream, it was mine, and I understood suddenly in a flash what my dream meant. This conflict illustrates a vital point about dream analysis. It is not so much a technique that can be learned and applied according to the rules as it is a dialectical exchange between two personalities. If it is handled as a mechanical technique, the individual psychic personality of the dreamer gets lost, and the therapeutic problem is reduced to the simple question: which of the two people concerned, the analyst or the dreamer, will dominate the other? I gave up hypnotic treatment for this very reason, because I did not want to impose my will on others. I wanted the healing process to grow out of the patient's own personality, not from suggestions by me that would have only a passing effect. My aim was to protect and preserve my patient's dignity and freedom, so that he could live his life according to his wishes. In this exchange with Freud, it dawned on me for the first time ever that before we construct general theories about men and his psyche, we should learn a lot more about the real human being we have to deal with. The individual is the only reality. The further we move away from the individual toward abstract ideas about Homo sapiens, the more likely we are to fall into error. In these times of social upheaval and rapid change, it is desirable to know much more than we do about the individual human being, for so much depends upon his mental and moral qualities. But if we are to see things in their right perspective, we need to understand the past of a man as well as his present. That is why an understanding of myths and symbols is of essential importance. And that, my dear friends, conclude my reading. Oh my god. What the fuck? This is insane. This page is the exact page where I last read this book. What? Okay, that's kind of creepy. I folded the page, like the corner of the page, to make sure that I know where to keep reading next time, and it is the exact fucking fold that I had on the book. What? Is that a symbol? It's like, is that a microaggression? But no, is that a symbol? Whoa. That was Carl Jung's spirit speaking through intuition, dude. That was, damn, I got is that a reference? Oh man, that was great. I think my throat's gonna die for sure, but it was worth it. And I can't believe there's still 30 people here. Unconscious action! Yas! Bro, that's kind of cool. That's hella cool. I hope I can finish this book. I'm not sure. I never finish anything, but Goodbye for the third kitty I paid for. Thank you. I'm gonna sleep now, guys. Since 30 people are still here, I guess my mission to make you fall asleep has failed. But I'm very happy that you guys joined me in this adventure into the unconscious mind. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, for listening, for being amazing, for existing. And that's it for me. I'm gonna see you in the next stream. はい。来てくれてありがとうございました。また次の配信でお会いしましょう。ありがとうございます。Cảm ơn mọi người đã đến xem mình và đã nghe mình đọc truyện. Mong mọi người sẽ có một buổi tối thật là vui vẻ. Vậy nhá. Cảm ơn. Bye bye. Bye bye. We are preparing for the descent of flight KR-13 into hell. Local time is eternal, and the temperature is hot as balls. Please check around your seats for any personal belongings, especially KROWKO merch available in the link in the description. Please also make sure that your subscribe button is pressed and the notification bell is turned on. Use caution when joining the Discord server, as you may be subject to degeneracy, shitposting, and a very wholesome and loving community. If you require deplaning assistance, please report to the comment sections down below. The captain will be very pleased to assist you. On behalf of KROWKO Airlines and the entire Crow Army crew, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this trip. We are looking forward to seeing you again on board in the future. Thank you.